going on up here, but we'll get class underway in just a second. When I called Kelly last week and asked him on short notice to cover for the Sunday morning sermon in class, I told him that my intention in class was to talk about gracious givers and to make reference to David and to the Good Samaritan and to the wise men as biblical examples of gracious givers. And he misunderstood, which was cool, turned it into a great sermon that he preached, but his sermon last week was my first class, basically, in talking about gracious givers. Because what I wanted to do in the 3 classes that we have in December is spend the first one talking about gracious givers, the second one today talking about gracious receivers, and then the third one talking about the gift that comes from sharing our gifts with others. So I want to spend some time now talking about gracious receivers. One of the things that I've perceived through the years, and I'm sure that you probably have too, is while we talk a lot, can somebody catch the doors in the back? Because a lot of noise bleeds through that way. And talk about how important it is that we be gracious givers, and it is important that we be gracious givers. But the fact of the matter is, I think many times for Christians, we have a whole lot harder time receiving than we do giving. We perceive giving as noble and right and something that we can do and aid in the lives of other people. But when it asking for somebody to help us or receiving aid from somebody else, I don't want to do that. I don't want to ask. I had a dear brother who really pinned my ears back on this one several years ago, and he shared with me this, and it's true, it's absolutely true. He said, if you need help, and you don't ask for that help, do you realize the injustice you do to your brothers and sisters in Christ? Because you strip them of the opportunity to help you, and in the process of that, to grow. And how can other people learn to give if you refuse to give them an opportunity to give? How can they learn to aid if you refuse to give them the opportunity to aid? There's a sense in which we have a responsibility to be just as gracious in our giving, in our receiving, as we are in our giving. A second observation, again and again through the years, what I've seen is that it seems too often that the people that the church helps the most turn out to be the least grateful. They're the ones that will somehow find a way to get a chip on their shoulder toward the church and walk away after brethren have gone out of their way again and again and again to aid them. And I wish I understood exactly the mentality that's involved in that, and I don't. But I've seen it consistently enough to know that it really makes people uncomfortable to be grateful. It makes them uncomfortable to feel as if they are in debt to someone else. And a lot of times, they'll actually walk away from a group that have been of tremendous aid to them, because I think they don't really know how to process receiving those gifts. And so I believe being a gracious receiver is as much a spiritual challenge, maybe a greater one, than being a gracious giver. I want to begin with an example of ungratefulness, because I think it's important to think about ungratefulness before we can really appreciate gratefulness. And of course, the example that immediately came to my mind, and probably comes to yours, are the Jews in the wilderness. In the book of Exodus, chapter 15, this is written beginning in verse 22. Then Moses made Israel set out from the Red Sea, and they went into the wilderness of Shur. They went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. When they came to Marah, they could not drink the water of Marah, because it was bitter. Therefore, it was named Marah. And oh, by the way, when you go to the book of Ruth, I don't know if you remember or not, but in the midst of the book of Ruth, Naomi is going to say to Ruth, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara. Same word here. Call me bitter. Because look at all that she had lost, and she's just saying, boy, life has not been a bowl of roses for me at all, okay? And the people grumbled against Moses, saying, what shall we drink? And he cried to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a log, and he threw it into the water, and the water became sweet. There the Lord made for them a statute and a rule, and there he tested them, saying, if you will diligently listen to the voice of the Lord your God, and do that which is right in his eyes, and give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of these diseases on you, so that I put on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord your healer. Then they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees, and they encamped there by the water. Now, this particular incident with the bitter water at Marah immediately follows God delivering them from the Egyptian army. He has just parted the Red Sea. He has allowed them to cross on dry land. He has not only set them free from the Egyptians, but he has set them free from the Egyptians trying to take them back. They are truly freed from Egypt. They have seen his hand in the remarkable things that have happened in Egypt. They have seen him part the Red Sea. And now, when they come to this place where the water's bitter, their immediate response is what? To grumble and to complain. And it's not over, because in chapter 16, they're going to grumble about the food that they've been given, and God is going to send them quail and manna. In chapter 17, they're going to grumble again about a lack of water, and God's going to send them water from a rock. And what's really interesting to me is in every situation up to that point, God, despite their grumbling, despite their ungratefulness, despite their lack of trust, is going to give them what they need. Now, how often are ungrateful receivers gifted by a gracious God? How often do we complain about this or that when we're so blessed in so many ways? And what does God do? He continues to gift us. And he continues to bless us in spite of our ungratefulness. And this amazing mix of grace and agape fascinates me. That God can take such blasphemy and nonsense from people and respond with loving care. Remember Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount? Does he send rain on the just and the unjust? He sure does, doesn't he? There are atheists out there that just glory in blaspheming him. And as far as I can tell, they get to eat their food and drink their water and breathe their air and go about their life just like we do, because of his grace. Now, this is very important. Are there consequences that come to ungratefulness? Yes, there are. Is there a point at which God's grace and God's agape stops and judgment comes? And the answer to that is yes, there is. In Numbers chapter 14, the spies have come back from the promised land. And they have said what? Oh, it's amazing. Man, it is everything God said it was going to be, except there are giants in that land and they make us look like grasshoppers, and if we go in there, we're going to be slaughtered. 10 of the 12. That's the report that they give. And the Jews are so put off by that despite the protestations of Joshua and Caleb, they're ready to stone Moses and just turn around and quit. And God is going to say this to them in Numbers 14, beginning of verse 32. But as for you, your dead bodies shall fall in this wilderness, and your children shall be shepherds in the wilderness 40 years, and shall suffer for your faithlessness, until the last of your dead bodies lies in the wilderness. According to the number of the days in which you spied out the land, 40 days, a year for each day, you shall bear your iniquity 40 years, and you shall know my displeasure. I, the Lord, have spoken. Surely this will I do to all this wicked congregation who are gathered together against me. In this wilderness they shall come to a full end, and there they shall die. God's grace and agape are amazing. They are. And they're shown again and again to Israel. But there comes a point where God says, okay, nope, no more. And when that happens and his judgment comes, it is fierce and it is final. And so grateful appreciation to our God, I believe, is very, very important. Now, two examples of gratefulness, of gracious receivers that I want us to look at. And the first one is found in Luke chapter 17, verses 11 through 19. If you want to turn there, I'll just read this to you. On the way to Jerusalem, he was passing along between Samaria and Galilee. And as he entered a village, he was met by 10 lepers who stood at a distance and lifted up their voices, saying, Jesus, Master, have mercy on us. When he saw them, he said to them, go and show yourselves to the priest. And as they went, they were cleansed. Then one of them, when he saw that he was healed, turned back, praising God with a loud voice, and he fell on his face at Jesus' feet, giving him thanks. Now he was a Samaritan. Then Jesus answered, were not 10 cleansed? Where are the 9? Was no one found to return and give praise to God except this foreigner? And he said to him, rise and go your way. Your faith has made you well. Now, let me share some observations from what happens here. First of all, fascinating. There's no indication that the ungrateful 9 are not healed. They don't come back, they don't say thank you, but the indication is they're healed of their leprosy. You don't have to be grateful to be blessed. I want you to think about that. You don't have to be grateful to be blessed. And I go back to this indication of God's amazing grace and his amazing agape and the way that he deals with people. But here I think is an example of that. The one who returns to give thanks is what? A Samaritan. Now, this is not the parable of the Good Samaritans. In the parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke 10, Jesus takes somebody despised by the Jews and makes him a hero. Here, this is real life. This is not a parable. And here you find the Samaritan, as Jesus calls him, that foreigner, being the one who comes back to Jesus and says, thank you. Isn't it amazing and telling that God's children, the Jews who are healed in this case, are less grateful than the outsider? How often are the blessed the least grateful? You know, I whine about eggs being $4 a dozen, but I've got the $4 to buy eggs, and there are eggs to be bought. Folks, there's a lot of places in this world where they don't have the $4 to buy the eggs. And if they had the $4 to buy the eggs, they couldn't buy them because the eggs aren't available. Can we whine in the midst of plenty? Be ungrateful when in reality we should be very grateful for what we have, for the way we're cared for and blessed? And I want you to think about this. Gratefulness is not a gift, folks. Gratefulness is an obligation. When we thank God for His blessings, we're not returning any kind of quid pro quo. We are acknowledging Him, and rightly so, as a source of our blessings. When somebody gives me a gift, I can give them a gift back, and there's a kind of quid pro quo there. When it comes to the gifts that God gives to me, there's no quid pro quo. I can't begin to match, even seek to match, what He's given to me. He's got it all anyway, doesn't He? He doesn't need anything. The only possible gift that I can give to my God that He doesn't already have is my faith and my love. That's it. That's it. Because He literally has everything else. And so, being thankful isn't a nice gesture. I believe it's way more than that. I think it is an obligation that we have to express to God our appreciation for the blessings that He's given to us. And again, it's a Samaritan who appreciates the gift. A Samaritan who comes back to say thank you. And his own people just blithely go on, enjoying the blessing without giving thanks. Now, the third example that I want us to look at from Scripture is found in Mark chapter 5. And this is the Gadarene demoniac, okay? I want to read this story to you so that you have the scene in mind. They came to the other side of the sea, so they've come over to the east side of the Sea of Galilee, to the country of the Gerasenes. And when Jesus had stepped out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. He lived among the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain, for he had often been bound with shackles and chains. But he wrenched the chains apart, and he broke the shackles in pieces. No one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, He was always crying out and cutting himself with stones. And when he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and fell down before him, and crying out with a loud voice, he said, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." For he was saying to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." And Jesus asked him, "What's your name?" He replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And he begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now a great herd of pigs was feeding there on the hillside. And they begged him, saying, "Send us to the pigs, let us enter them." So he gave them permission. And the unclean spirits came out and entered the pigs, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and drowned in the sea. The herdsmen fled and told it in the city and in the country, and people came to see what it was that had happened. And they came to Jesus and saw the demon-possessed man, the one who had had the legion, sitting there clothed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. And those who had seen it described to them what had happened to the demon-possessed man and to the pigs, and began to beg Jesus to depart from their region. And as he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed with demons begged him that he might be with him. And he did not permit him, but said to him, "Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you. And now he has had mercy on you." And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him. And everyone marveled. Now, the Decapolis were 10 Gentile cities that sat in the northeastern quadrant of the Promised Land. They're not mentioned much in the Gospels at all because that's not the territory in which the Jews moved. But this man who had been a demon-possessed, a demoniac, becomes an evangelist, preaching the good news to the Gentiles. But what I want you to notice is this. In this man's grateful appreciation for what Jesus has done for him, the freedom that Jesus has given to him, what does he want? Does he leave saying, "Oh well, you know, for years and years and years, I earn my living as this, and I'm going to go back and I'm going to do that again"? No. His reaction to have been blessed like this is what? He begged him that he might be with him. I want you to notice the force of that. That's chapter 5, verse 18. This man who had been freed from demons begs Jesus, "I want to go with you. I want to be with you." Now, how many people who had been healed begged Jesus to go with them? Begged Jesus for the opportunity to go with him? You don't run across that very often at all, do you? Is this a grateful receiver? Is this a man who absolutely believes that God has blessed him in an unbelievable way? Yeah. I think about that fellow, and I love that story in John chapter 9 when Jesus heals the man born blind there. And the Pharisees do everything they can to get that man to shut up, to get that man to change his story, and he won't do it. And now Jesus seeks that man out to find him and reassure him. But here, this man begs Jesus, let me follow you. I want to follow you. And I think Jesus' response is interesting because also, if you'll note in the book of Mark, there are going to be times, go back to earlier healings, to the healing of a leper back in chapter 1, and Jesus will tell that man, don't tell anybody about what I've done for you. I believe there's a reason for that. But he'll tell that man, don't tell anybody about what I've done for you. But here Jesus says, no, don't follow me. What I want you to do is go back to the people that you know and who know you. And I want you to tell them the good news about what I've done for you and how I'd show mercy on you. And I've got to think, we talk about people having a testimony. Does that man have a compelling testimony? Does he have quite a story to share? He really does, doesn't he? And I've often wondered what impact that had in that whole region. When that man went back, and unquestionably, there's no doubt that people knew and were aware of just how crazy and out of control and dangerous this man had been. Okay, because what is described here is scary beyond belief, isn't it? What this guy's capable of. And how shocked they are when they find this man in his right mind and everything is seemingly normal again. For him to be able to go back and say, this is what Jesus did for me. What a powerful, powerful thing. And you think about that today. Some of those powerful testimony stories that I've heard have come from people who were in bondage to addiction. They were demon possessed, but they were in bondage. And freed from their bondage to drugs or alcohol or whatever it might be, in Christ they found freedom. And they want to share that freedom that they enjoy. By the way, and this is a little tangent off here, but I wanted to share this with you. I was reading an article the other day that was talking about the use of methamphetamine and fentanyl. And I was not aware the methamphetamine that is now being sold and used is about twice the potency of what it was a few years ago. And it has to do with the fact, unfortunately, that the manufacturers of the drugs, these Mexican gangs and other groups down in Latin America, have gotten better at refining it and got better at purifying it. It was already incredibly addictive and incredibly dangerous. And they have now magnified that. This article, which came from a DEA agent, was also talking about fentanyl. And he was saying that, I'd never heard this before, I hadn't even thought about it. But he said, when have you heard of an old fentanyl addict? Now, I've heard about old heroin addicts. There are people who have been addicted to heroin for 30 and 40 years. I've heard of old heroin addicts. He said, you haven't heard of an old fentanyl addict because there is no such thing. Nobody lives to old age who's addicted to fentanyl. It kills them. He said that fentanyl, I didn't know this either, that the effects of fentanyl leave very quickly. That's why doctors like to use it for surgeries and things like that, because there's not a lot of hangover from fentanyl. It very quickly, its effects dissipate. And so it smacks, it hits, it has its effect, and then it leaves. But he said, this makes it much, much more addictive. And he said, where a heroin addict might need 2 or 3 injections a day to get by. A fentanyl addict is going to need 4 or 5 or 6 because the effects leave so quickly and so completely, and then they're absolutely miserable and have got to get that next fix. So one of the reasons that it's being pushed and shared and spread like it has is because the gangs and others recognize there's a whole lot more money to be made off the fentanyl than the heroin because of its addictive properties. But the bottom line is, in all of this, more than ever, people need to hear the gospel message. They are never going to free themselves from the bonds of sin without Jesus. And as we have the opportunity to share that good news message, and we have young men like Justin and others who've been there and done that and endured that and got to the other side of that, God has given us incredible tools to use in sharing that good news message, because that's exactly what it is. And so we need to be graceful givers. We also very much need to be graceful receivers. God bless. Thank you. See you this evening.